So that brings us to tonight. We're so excited tonight to be welcoming Amanda Stockwell. She is here to talk to us about UX research in an Agile world. And we are going to have a little Q&A time at the end. So if you have questions that come up for Amanda, please do put those in the chat and we will bring those up at the end of the presentation. And with that, we'll welcome Amanda Stockwell.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The typical Zoom intro where it'll take a second for us to share, but let's see. Pretty sure I can do this. I did it like 3 times this morning while I was running sessions. So awesome. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I always like to start by either a picture of somewhere I've gone or something I've done recently. So I went to a Smash Room yesterday for those of you who are also in Denver. It was in South Denver. It was super fun. I highly recommend it if you have some pent-up energy. Really fun, but luckily I'm not here to destroy anything today. So in fact, I'm going to be talking about adjusting UX research for an Agile world. So let me just go ahead and begin by doing, maybe we can do like a quick poll of like, when I say Agile and I start talking about what that means, is everybody on board with that? That like Agile is like the duct tape of fixing things. Any problem you have in technology, just apply Agile methodologies, all will be fine, kind of. And so here's the thing, there's a lot of really great things about Agile. Agile is all about pivoting, right? The idea kind of behind Agile is that you're not stuck on any one thing. You're supposed to be able to adjust to getting feedback. And pivoting, as everyone in research and strategy knows, is like really fundamental to being able to get what you need. I don't know if you can see that background, but it's a blurred out version of Slack. For those of you who don't know, Slack was originally a game company, and Slack was the tool that they built internally just to kind of communicate with themselves. And obviously the game did not work, but Slack sure did. And so, you know, pivoting is wonderful. It's one of the really great parts of Agile. There's a lot of good stuff about it. Collaboration is meant to be king or queen, right? It's all about kind of cross-team collaboration, cross-functional collaboration, making sure that, you know, kind of everybody is involved in everything. All of that is wonderful. However, just like duct tape, Agile is actually really designed for one thing. It's really best for kind of certain circumstances. In this case, not building a boat. And I feel like UX research is kind of the like duct tape kayak of technology. It's a really great idea. And it sounds like it should work really well, right? Like it seals out water. But when it comes right down to it, there's some issues kind of with Agile and UX research. And let me be abundantly clear that this is by no means a talk where I'm going to talk about how awful Agile is and it's not useful UX research and whatever. Instead, what I want to talk about is kind of where like Agile came from and the strengths of it, and how those of us in UX research and strategy can really kind of integrate it well and make it work. And so let me also be clear by saying to all of you that I am a UX research and strategy consultant, and all that really means is that I work with lots of different kinds of organizations. I work with teams of 1 all the way up to giant, massive UX research teams that have like 50 people on them. So I have seen the way that Agile is supposed to work in lots of different places. And I am going to kind of share with you the things that I have found work across the board. But I will always put the caveat that your mileage may vary. And we'll talk about that a bit as well. So there are some specific challenges that those of us, especially when we're trying to incorporate research, have when it comes in sort of an Agile environment. So one of the things is that Agile has a huge focus on measuring progress in terms of code. That's because Agile is a development methodology that was kind of put together. It was the brainchild of developers. And the reason that the people who came up with Agile came up with it is because they were basically tired of having really lengthy discovery periods and then working on things for several years that were no longer really necessary, right? Nobody likes building stuff that nobody wants. All of us in the UX research and strategy world know that. And even the developers knew that. However, they specifically designed Agile to address challenges that they were having from a coding and development side of things. So a huge push in Agile is to measure everything by how much code you've written. And obviously with research, that's not really a good way to measure learning. That's not a good way to measure our progress. Sometimes, in fact, the most important thing I can tell somebody is not to build something at all. We'll get to that. And also in Agile kind of cycles, there's very often no dedicated time for UX research. And theoretically, that's because it's supposed to be happening all the time. But in real life, what this often means is that if research doesn't fit neatly into 2-week sprints or however long your sprint cycles are, it means that it keeps getting deprioritized and there's no time at all. So I'm going to tell you a big fat secret, which is, again, after almost 15 years of working on Agile teams, and nearly all of that spent focused on user experience research and strategy. There is no one right way to do this. I'm sorry, you're not going to leave here with a checklist of like 5 things you must do. You're going to leave here with some strong suggestions, but the thing about Agile is that it is intended to be exploratory. It is intended to be a thing that you kind of explore and test out and make sure is right for your team. So from organization to organization, it does not look the same, even from team to team within the same product line at the same organization. Some things that might work for some people don't work for others. So the number one thing I want you to take away from all of this is that there is no one right way, one formula that you need in order to be successful with this. You're going to have to experiment and you're going to have to try some things out because, yep, we are all special snowflakes. Every team, every kind of organization, you're all going to have different kind of crevices and cracks and intricate designs that you're going to have to account for. And that's not only okay, that's part of the beauty of Agile if you can embrace it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of walk through a bunch of the core things that people often have questions about around Agile, or that often doesn't work so well in sort of traditional Agile settings from a UX research perspective. And I'm going to start with team makeup because a lot of my work has to do with helping teams that are newer to UX research or newer to kind of working in Agile, sort of integrating UX research. And one of the core fundamental things that impacts how the work gets done is how the teams are made up. You might not always have control over this, but kind of hearing the different pros and cons is really helpful for people. So, again, with Agile, theoretically, you're supposed to be cross-functional for all, right? So that is great in theory. That's a lovely thought. And it's really great if you notice kind of my ideal situation is that you have an actually cross-functional team where you have a UX designer and a UX researcher, and they're not the same person. If you can pull this off, and of course, there might be a few more front-end devs or a few more back-end devs or whatever, but I would really focus on, if you can at all, having a dedicated person who's in research and a different person who's a dedicated designer. There's lots of reasons for this, one of which is probably not news to any of you. It's because it's really hard to be unbiased about your own work, and doesn't have anything to do with how well trained you are or what your intentions are. It's impossible not to think the idea that you came up with is a good one. That's how this works. So if you're looking at this and you're like, yeah, that would be awesome, but there's no freaking way that could happen in my organization, kind of my second best suggestion is to have a dedicated team of researchers that support a couple of different cross-functional teams. But you'll notice that they still all have an embedded UX designer and some researchers maybe who can link together and serve those different teams. And if you're still looking at this and you're like, yeah, that's still just not even a little bit feasible, okay, fine. If you've only got one person who can be dedicated, and they have to do some of each, having a bit of, a bit of design and a bit of research, as long as there's somebody dedicated on the team, it's doable, right? It means you get extra magic powers. It means you're like a real magical being. You get kind of a rainbow horn automatically if you get put in that position. But if you do this, I highly recommend pairing up and helping each other do research on your designs, because everyone knows if you design something, if you build something, if it's your idea, then it's really hard to remain neutral during the session. So I really highly recommend that you pair up and kind of focus on researching, especially when it comes to evaluation work, evaluating each other's work if you're also meant to do design. And please, for the love of God, don't make there be one person who's meant to do absolutely everything for entire teams. That's just, it'll burn you out. If you're in this situation now, I know lots of people hiring, I can pass on suggestions to you. You're going to be exhausted. So anyway, all of that is to say, I really recommend when it comes to team makeup, if you possibly can, having dedicated researchers and having either a dedicated team of researchers that can serve multiple teams, or at the very least pairing up research people with the different teams. Okay, so that all is probably stuff that you're like, yeah, cool, but maybe I don't have any control over that. So another thing that I hear people say all the time when we're talking about UX research is we don't have time for that because we can't figure out the logistics. It's so much time. There's so much setup. I can't possibly do that. And so I'm going to share a bunch of the things that I've seen work really well across different places, no matter how large they were, no matter whether they had 1 week sprints or 5 week sprints, or whether they had sprints at all. I've seen some things that really helped to kind of start integrating UX research. So the first one is whether or not you're using sprints, make a regular cadence for it. Dedicate, whether it's once every 2 weeks or once a month or whatever. If you're on a product team and you are building something and like working towards that, or even if you're rebuilding something or redesigning something, just go ahead and set up time to do research on a regular cadence. You might not know what you're going to research in 2 weeks, but I guarantee you, if you're working on a rapid team and you have time set aside to do it, you'll find questions that you need answers to. Never have I ever been in a situation where the problem with UX research was that we didn't have any open questions and therefore needed no research. And also hold it sacred, right? So like, don't schedule team lunches or your dentist appointments or whatever. Make it as important as the rest of the sort of like Agile ceremonies. So if you would never skip sprint planning, never skip your every other sprint research sessions or whatever. But one of the things that is sort of important to keep in mind is that in UX research with Agile teams, it's really easy, especially when you're doing a really regular cadence of things, to get really invested in the nitty gritty, teeny tiny design and the evaluation questions, right? It's easy to just say, okay, well, we're going to compare these 2 different interaction patterns or whatever. But I also really recommend making sure that you have a cadence for more regular exploratory discovery or big picture work as well. So of course, this depends on the kind of thing that you're working on, but having something, say, once a quarter or twice a year or something like that, to really take a step back and not just say, kind of explore teeny tiny design decisions every other week, but to really have a regular cadence where you can take a step back and say, hey, let's touch base with our prospective users. How have their needs changed since last year? I think that, it's probably a cliche at this point, but anybody who entered 2020 with a specific plan probably can feel this, right? Like, things change rapidly, needs change rapidly, technology changes rapidly, and frankly, the world is changing all the time right now. And so making sure that you have dedicated time, not just to do kind of like small exploratory studies, but also to take steps back and get in touch with your user base and be able to inform some of that strategic work is really important. So again, I really recommend kind of setting a regular cadence for both kind of more granular work and bigger picture work. And then just like a fairly minor, but like big pain in the butt thing that people who are newer to research or kind of getting with this always say about is that like scheduling is always such a bummer, right? Like it's such a pain. But I really recommend that you allow participants to schedule themselves. This is a screenshot actually from a tool that no longer works, but it's now defunct, but Calendly has the same functionality where you can set up when you're available. I think a lot of research tools have kind of similar things, but if you have dedicated time and you know at the beginning of the year that you're going to be doing research every 3 weeks or every quarter or whatever, you can go ahead and start scheduling people and recruiting for things way ahead of time, and letting people schedule their own takes out so much logistics work on the back end of trying to find time and going back and forth with people. And along with that, I really recommend making your own panel if you possibly can. So we are lucky now that there are tons of great ways to recruit. There are tons of tools that I like. But if you're working on an Agile team that has an existing product and you already have users, it's very likely that you already have plenty of means of communication, plenty of channels of communication with your users. So whether that's social media outreach or support calls. Actually, I love recruiting people from when they call into support. For one, it gives your support reps a tool. So if somebody calls in really upset about something, after they help them, of course, they can say, hey, we're actually working on that feature. Would you be interested in getting paid to give your feedback on that thing? It is a fairly magical assuasions tool for customer support reps. But more importantly, having a list of people that you can reach out to regularly really cuts down on sort of the logistical every study mess of trying to find people, trying to try this tool, try that tool, getting a quote from this server. So if you can find a way to build people over time, and I have done this at larger companies that had existing CRMs, and you can sort of customize your Salesforce integration, but it could also be as simple as, this is obviously a blurred out, but a Google Doc that I had with one of my clients. And they had about 10 people that they knew that they could reach out to. That wasn't a lot, but we sort of started adding to it slowly over time. And we just kept very general notes, like contact information, what kind of persona they were, any notes we had about interactions with them, and when we last contacted them. So you don't need to be fancy. You don't need to have a CRM. If you have access to a spreadsheet, you can kind of get started on this yourself. Okay, great. So that's a bunch of logistics stuff. But what about like the actual research, right? What about the actual planning and conducting of the research? There's a lot of kind of things that people run up against in Agile settings here too. So some tips for you is, one, try to write specific hypotheses to narrow your scope. Depending on what you're working on, you might have dozens or hundreds of questions, or you might have one question that is really huge, right? So when you're going to have many rounds of research, in order to narrow things down so that you can get them into a bit smaller chunks, you can write specific hypotheses. And this can be true whether you are evaluating a small design decision or you're trying to uncover who your user base is, right? Like it can be at any level. You can still write a hypothesis to kind of narrow things down, because the truth is that most of the time you and the team is going to have assumptions anyway. So kind of getting them out in the open and kind of trying to narrow the scope as much as possible will help. Here is a framework that I like to use for kind of writing down your hypotheses. This is especially good if you're evaluating a specific thing, but it can be used in lots of different contexts. So it's kind of pulled from the lean UX world, but it goes basically, if we do build or provide something, right? So that's basically your idea. or the feature you want to build or the change you want to make, then these people, those are your target users, your personas, will do something you want them to. They will buy something, they will sign up for something, they'll be able to send their email, whatever it is you want them to do, they'll do it. And we'll know that when some kind of actionable metric. And so the reason that I really like this framework is because it forces you to think about all of these things before you start the research. And especially with the actionable metrics, you might not know what that is. You might not know what that looks like. And we could and maybe should spend a whole hour on determining what actionable metrics are. So we can follow up with this if we want to. But the idea is to think through kind of what you're proposing, what questions you have, who you want to include, what you want them ultimately to do, and how you're going to define success. And that, kind of thinking through all of this before you actually run any research can really help you kind of narrow down the scope and help other people see the value in making sure that you've incorporated research on a regular basis. And just kind of a general tip, the more specific your hypothesis, the easier it will be both to plan your research and ultimately to come to conclusions later. Because if you already have a really clear definition of what success is, it will be much easier to determine if you have reached that success. We'll talk about that more in a second. Okay, and then the other one, I really recommend that people use Franken methods. And what I mean by Franken methods is, especially for those of us who come from a pretty academic or rigorous research background, it can be really easy to feel like, well, we don't have a big enough sample size, or we can't run it exactly the way I want to, or actually I have one question that would kind of be best answered by a diary study and another one that would be best answered by an interview, right? But so I really recommend not being precious with your methods and kind of taking and picking and choosing the things, the benefits from different methods in order to get to what you want. So for instance, maybe you end up doing a little bit of a survey, but you include some screenshots and ask people to interact with them. Or maybe you run a usability test, but you include a little feature prioritization exercise at the end of it. Is it exactly how I would recommend designing that piece of research based on my, rigorous research background? Probably not. But will it give us some information that will help us make decisions moving forward? Yeah, totally. So be willing to experiment with methods, be willing to mesh things together, be willing to, kind of embrace the ugly in the methods when it'll get you what you want. However, try to balance flexibility and rigor. So if you're going to make a trade-off in one way with a piece of research and the rigor of that, try to balance it out in another way. So for instance, if you, let's say you're running usability tests and you really need to evaluate something, if you decide that you're going to run things unmoderated, even though you'd prefer to do them in a moderated way, maybe you can actually include more people. Or vice versa, maybe you say, okay, we only have time in this particular round to include 4 or 5 people. So we're going to make sure that they're moderated and we're going to include a little bit of extra time in each of them or something. So again, there's no hard and fast rules here. But my point being in that you're probably going to have to make some trade-offs in terms of rigor. And so try to make sure that when you do that, you balance that out by kind of compensating in different ways. And there are lots of different ways to do that. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but just having that mindset of what can we cut and still maintain enough rigor and to get good quality responses and good quality results is really important in an Agile setting. But that being said, when in doubt, recycle. And no, I'm not talking about wine bottles. What I mean is that one, if you have things regularly scheduled every, whatever cadence that you've determined is right for your team, and you don't think you have any open questions, well, go ahead and rerun a past piece of research that you've done. see if you get consistent results. Try the same test with a different, maybe a different slice of users, a different target audience. Or if you did it moderated one time, try it unmoderated another way. This is helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it can help you establish baselines, so you can see if things are changing over time, which is really important in an Agile team. But two, it absolutely eliminates all of the planning and all of the questions about like, what are we going to study and who are we going to include and all of that stuff. So when you're absolutely in doubt, I really recommend recycling and either running really similar pieces of research again, or trying to answer the same question with a slightly different method and see if you can repeat and kind of get consistent feedback. And if you do, that's great. That doesn't mean that it was a waste of time. It means that you're confirming findings and getting probably further nuance to them. And if you do find something different, then either something has changed about the users or their usage or their context of usage, or it means that you need to explore and be a bit more careful about your rigor in one study or another. It's a good kind of gut check for yourself. And importantly, one of the really great things about Agile is that everything is meant to be shared. Teamwork and collaboration is a huge component of Agile. So one of my very favorite things to do with Agile research is to make sure that I'm sharing the load. And I don't just mean with other UX researchers, I mean, pull in product managers, pull in designers, pull in developers, pull in marketing people, pull in support reps. And we'll talk about a bit more to do this, but even if it's something like you need somebody to take notes for the sessions that you're running, or it would be really great if there could be a host to like let people into the lab or to monitor the Zoom room and make sure that everybody is getting connected okay. This sometimes can seem like a challenge in kind of incorporating research into Agile teams, because sometimes there can be some resistance, especially because there's such a code first mindset in a lot of organizations. People can be like, I'm a developer, I need to be writing code, I can't possibly be a part of that. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you can get to a point where you really can include the rest of the team members, one, that it will take a bit of the load off of you, right? You won't feel like you're alone, but also it is really powerful to learn things together. So there's, we kind of joke about this, but there is nothing more powerful than watching somebody cry with trying to use something that you've built. And it is not the same to show them a video clip. It is not the same to write up a report. It is just not the same as having somebody who built something or designed something watching actual people interact with it, especially if they're having a really hard time. And then it kind of removes you from being the messenger. Then they can see it and observe it and learn it right along with you at the same time. So when you can, pull people in. And a little pro tip, a little tip around this is, okay, yes, ideally, you'd be able to just throw a meeting on people's calendar and they'd be like, sure, I have time for that. I will absolutely come help you with this UX research. But not always. You can be creative about compelling people to join you. So for instance, at one of my old offices, there was a toaster oven in the observation room. I would half bake a loaf of banana bread at home, and then I would put it in the toaster oven in the observation room, and it would make the whole floor smell delicious. And people would always come around and be like, ooh, what's that? Like, can I have some? Yeah, totally, you can have some if you come in and watch a session. And I have been known to order pizza. I have been known to offer whiskey. I've been known to offer a lot of things. It's not bribery per se, but it is sweetening the deal. And I'm joking a little bit, but the other thing is to help people see how their involvement not only helps you, but actually helps them, right? So for instance, I once worked with a front-end developer who was really having trouble trying to sort out a particularly complicated interaction. And they were very stressed about it, and they were kind of overwhelmed, and they just could not get it. And finally, I was like, would it be helpful to you if I just went ahead and like tell me the one that your gut is pulling towards, and let's test it. Let's see how it goes. Let's compare them. Then it's not up to you. Then you don't have to make the decision. We can actually just get feedback on it, and then we'll move forward, and we'll have more confidence about which one works better. And it literally hadn't occurred to that person that we could get some feedback on it, and that they didn't have to be solely responsible for deciding exactly how that would work and making it happen. And so, an incentive can look like a lot of things. Yes, it can look like bread or pizza or candy or whatever, but it can also look like, let me help you. Let me take this off of your plate. Let me help you make this decision. Very rarely are people opposed to getting help or opposed to making their jobs easier. So when you can, frame things in a way that will help people see how their job is made easier by involving themselves. Okay, and so once you've done all of the research and you get to the part where you have a bunch of data, sometimes this is a part where people get stuck too, because although theoretically in Agile, there's a big push to respond to user feedback. That doesn't always exactly happen, or it can feel like there's so much data to weed through that it's hard to get any of it actually integrated back into the plan. So I'll talk to you again about a couple of things that I've seen work really well across different teams. Okay, so another reason that it is really useful to include lots of people in the sessions is that then you can also include them in the analysis. And to be fair, you can include people in the analysis even if they weren't in the sessions. But there's a couple of reasons for this. So one is that, again, if you've got everybody helping you analyze, it's very likely to go faster. But more importantly, I'm a really great researcher, but I haven't coded in a really long time. You probably don't want me touching any backend code. I don't remember that much of it, frankly. And there's probably going to be something as we're kind of coming up that, a backend engineer on the team will have perspective that you might not have, or they'll notice, a front-end developer or an interaction designer might notice something about the way something was implemented that I might not catch immediately. And so making sure that everybody's kind of various perspectives and expertise is embedded in the findings as soon as you're analyzing helps you make sure that you aren't going to need to go back and sell them on the idea, because it'll be partially their idea that came up with it, that kind of looked at all of the data. And again, with that kind of learning together piece of it, if people are involved along the way, they'll be a lot more invested in the outcome of it. If they're the one who remembered, hey, remember people kept getting stuck on this piece, or hey, we kept noticing that this component was particularly interesting, whatever it is. Getting people to be included in the sessions and the analysis really cuts down on the amount of sort of later convincing that you need to do, or even presenting, really. Because if people were there with you, then they will very likely kind of already have it embedded. They won't have to process it and think about it and then interpret it. They'll kind of already be there with you when we get to the conclusions. And then again, a reminder, if you set a specific targeted hypothesis, analysis becomes much easier. So this is more true for evaluative type work than really exploratory work, but it can even be true if you're doing something like, say, you're exploring personas. If you have a really clear hypothesis about who your personas are, and then people either fit the pattern or they don't, that's much easier to analyze than just sort of having an open discussion of like, who are these people? We have no idea. Let's start looking, right? So the more specific you are about what questions you want to answer and what your sort of hypotheses are about those things, the better. Now, you have to be careful with this because you don't want to bias your results, right? Like, you don't want to go looking to confirm or validate an idea at the beginning. That's not what research is for. It's not just to prove that you were right. But the truth is that everybody has some sort of bias or some sort of assumption to begin with. Now, maybe that's based on past research, and that's great. Maybe that's based on their experience working with another team or the fact that they've been there for 10 years. But just the truth is that the team is going to have assumptions going in. So if you can be really clear about what those things are, it does make analyzing against those things and looking at patterns a bit easier when it comes to the analysis piece. And especially if you're doing something like evaluation, it can be pretty easy to then kind of decide what you're going to do. If you have a hypothesis that a new feature is going to be helpful and that everybody loves it and ends up using it a bunch in a beta test or whatever research it is that you're running, great. You just stay the course. You keep going, keep running, keep going. Or you might have really clear feedback that you need to pivot. Maybe the team, suggested a particular interaction and it is just not working. Sometimes it's really obvious that you're on the right path, and sometimes it's really obvious that you are not on the right path. But sometimes the next path is vague, right? Like sometimes it's not clear what you should be doing, even if you set a really clear hypothesis, and even if you are doing a really straightforward evaluation. Sometimes you're like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure this isn't working that well, but I have no idea what would work better. Or maybe you get really mixed feedback. That's okay. That actually in and of itself is a really important learning, right? Like the fact that there isn't clear positive or negative feedback, or there isn't a clear next path, is a signal to you that you need to kind of go back to exploration, and maybe you need to do some more ideation, or you need to do some more foundational work to understand the user base, or something in context has changed or something. So that in and of itself, that learning, that doesn't mean that you failed. It doesn't mean that the research wasn't worth it. It's a cue about where you should go next. And so again, sometimes you're not really sure what to do. And this is the point at which you're like, all right, now we need to figure out what was unclear. And now we need to maybe go down both of those paths, or maybe we need to come up with a new path altogether. But regardless of what direction that is, I really recommend that you find solutions together. And by this, I mean, not just you and another researcher or you and a designer. I mean, whoever is involved in your team, if you can get an architect or a backend person or a front-end person or whoever, this is for a couple of reasons. One is because, frankly, it is just faster to be able to sketch things out sometimes. Like sometimes you don't need to go through a full process of sketching it on a whiteboard and then making a wireframe and then making a prototype. Sometimes you just need to have a discussion, and that's fine. But more importantly, finding solutions together on a cross-functional Agile team is important because of what I said before about people are inherently drawn to their own ideas. If, say, the product manager on my team suggested something, or the backend developer suggested something, they're going to be a champion of that idea. And if they can see the elements of their feedback in whatever ultimately gets built or what gets proposed, then you automatically have champions built in for whatever you're proposing. And then it kind of avoids this situation where, I don't know, well, I personally have been in this situation. I don't know about any of you, but as a UX researcher, sometimes we're the bearers of bad news, right? We're the ones who are like, yeah, that thing you just spent 5 years building, nobody wants it. Whoops. Or, yeah, that thing that, how there were two solutions and one of them you could build in a week and one is going to take like 6 months. We have to build the one that's going to take 6 months, right? Like nobody really wants to be put in that position. But if your team comes to that decision together, it will be a much easier fight. It'll be a much easier battle to kind of advocate for the things that are best for the users. And usually the best way to get people to kind of agree with that is if they were there when the solution was being, kind of come up with, right? Or the various solutions. So really take advantage of that. And also because you'll never have the gotcha moment of, well, that's technically not feasible, right? Or, you'll already know what kind of all the gotchas are if everybody is involved from the beginning. And then also, let's just be honest, like, even though it'd be wonderful if you could get your entire team to show up to all of the, research sessions and then analyze with you, like, let's just be honest, that's not going to happen all of the time. It's just not. And so finding really simple ways to keep everyone in the loop. I know that documentation in Agile is kind of a dirty word, but you still have to do it. You still have to have some documentation. You still have to be able to look back and look at things for posterity's sake. So I have a couple of things that I do. One is I have an email template that I use. You can see it's super simple. It's one paragraph that says, like, here's what I did. Here's what my hypotheses were. Here are the 2 or 3 takeaways. Here's the stuff that we need to do next. And I have this rule. It should never take me more than 15 minutes to write, and it should never take anybody more than 5 minutes to read. And I send those emails out at the same time every sprint. So everybody knows on Thursday afternoon with this one particular client, they're like, on Thursday afternoon, we're going to get an email from Amanda. It's going to tell us 3 things we need to know and 2 things we need to do next. That is always the case. People come to expect it. And again, it goes back to sort of the rituals within Agile, taking advantage of that. And kind of the reason I chose Thursday afternoon is because planning is on Monday usually. So Thursday afternoon, I say all this stuff, we talk about it, and we kind of digest. And then on Monday, when we're planning, we look at the do next section from that email, and we make sure that that's accounted for in the next planning session. The other thing that I really recommend is having some sort of easy repository for past research. Again, there could be, and probably has been and should be, entire hours dedicated to talking about research repositories and how to organize information. And there are lots of different ways to do this, but what I will say is that the Agile desire to get rid of documentation doesn't mean that you should not store anything. It can be super simple. Again, this is another spreadsheet. It literally, all it has in it is, here's what sprint it is, here's what we did, here's what we found, and a link to more details. And in this case, it was whoever the point person was, because there was a couple of us who were working on that project. And the link to details had the full research plan, kind of all the summaries, and if applicable, links to watch the sessions. Now, that's not perfect, but finding an easy way to keep everyone in the loop, such that if they're out for a week, or a new person joins the team, or you start on a new initiative that is, could benefit from past research, having this kind of easy documentation really helps with moving forward. And finally, I really recommend that people actually add the things that they find in research to the backlogs, right? So in Agile, a huge thing for a lot of teams, and everybody kind of does this differently, but a huge thing is whether there should be a separate UX backlog and a dev backlog, and should they cross or should they not, and whatever. Personally, I think that it's fine if there's a separate backlog in terms of what work needs to get done, but you need to pull your takeaways from the research, and it has to go into the dev backlog, because if not, it's never going to get work done. It has to be prioritized with all of the other work. And so I know that this sounds like a kind of simple thing, but making sure that you actually add the things that you found, the things you need to address. And it might be, again, it might be that you are really clear, you know exactly what to do. It might be that you need to run another round of research because you're not exactly sure what should happen next. There are lots of different ways that this can go, but the single biggest thing I say about this when talking about kind of integrating research is that none of it matters if you don't do anything with the information, right? So make sure that whatever you're learning, you infuse that back into the team, back into the plans for upcoming sprints, back into the plans for, however you're going to change or move forward. And in most cases in Agile teams, the way to do that is through the backlog. All right, and then just remember, always be learning. Thank you. Good night. That's my dog, Bremer. He's the star of all of my talks. Thanks, everyone.
I love it. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. We've got more than a couple of questions for you that popped up in the chat as you went through. So there were some ones around analyzing the data. Like, how do you plan, like, how can you communicate to your fellow Agile team members how long it will take you and what the process is, and how can you help them plan for that analysis that you're going to have to do?
Good point. Okay, so well, one, you have to know how long it's going to take you before you can clearly communicate that to yourself. So some of that is getting a bit of experience with figuring out how long you're really going to need. Some of that has to do with being clear again about what your goals are when you go into the research, right? So the way that I analyze usability test data and a super evaluative session is really different than the way that I analyze an exploratory interview, right? And so, but even if it's super exploratory, there are probably certain defined things that that you can look at. So for instance, right now I'm working on a project with an app for kids that is supposed to be like educational and entertainment. There are certain components that even when we're doing really exploratory research, we know that we might get feedback on the content. We know we might get feedback on the characters. We know we might get feedback on technical issues. And so having some predefined sort of like areas of interest, which can stem from your research goals, can really help kind of give people a framework to center their attention around and center their analysis around. And you can totally time box it, right? Because one of the troubles with research analysis, especially exploratory work, is that I could do like 30 rounds, right? Like I could keep going. But you don't have to, right? Or you could kind of time box it and say, okay, for this particular study, we're gonna do 5 interviews and we're gonna take 1 2-hour chunk to do, to kind of extract all of our initial insights. And then we're gonna eat lunch, we're gonna go do some other stuff. And then we're gonna spend another hour organizing them. And then we're gonna go home for the day. And then we're gonna spend another hour organizing them the next day. And will that get you entirely all of the time that you need? Probably not, but will it be so much more helpful because everybody has clear expectations and knows what to focus on during that time? Yup, totally. And again, that time will change depending on what you're doing and who's involved and how big the project is and all of that. But I would say trying to purposely time box it and time box it in a way that is reasonable for your team. Like, is it reasonable for everybody to be in the same team or same room all at the same time? Maybe not. Maybe it's okay if people do asynchronous delineation of individual insights, or you can divide and conquer. Like, hey, you two kind of look for all of the information that had to do with technical issues, and I'll look for all of the information that had to do with content or whatever. A big part of that also is knowing your team and knowing their strengths and knowing what you can reasonably ask them to do. And so a component of this that I didn't mention, because it's not specific to UX research, but I think is important to remember, that anytime you're working cross-functionally or just collaborating in general, so much of your success depends on your relationship capital and your ability to know and trust and be trusted by your teammates. So that's not specific to UX research, but it is really important.
No, definitely. And do you have any resources offhand that you can point anybody to for better, like to get better at analyzing the data?
Oh, well, I teach a class on it. So if people are interested, there's a LinkedIn Learning class that I teach about analyzing data. That can be helpful. One of the things that I was on one of my slides was something called the rainbow. I think it's the rainbow chart. Tomer Sharon, I can look. That's a note-taking device, but it does also make analysis easier because it sort of predefines some particular elements that people are looking at, and you kind of tag and code as you go with note taking. That can be really helpful. I don't know off the top of my head. I know he's written a bunch of articles and I've read lots of them and they were all helpful, but I can find them afterwards and send them to people. But that I find, especially when you're including lots of different people in note taking and analysis, that's been a really useful tool for me.
That's for sure. Yeah, if you find any, send them to us and then we can email them out to everybody as well. Totally happy to share.
Okay.
Let's see. So speaking of Agile and tracking data in Agile, how have you been able to successfully track design decisions and like track them back to the research that was done?
Yeah, that's tricky. Honestly, it's not an easy thing to do. So let me just go ahead and put that caveat out there. Again, there is no magic answer. But that's part of the reason I really recommend having some sort of repository for research, because one of the things that goes into my notes when I have kind of a summary of the research that got done, and that email that says like, here's what we need to do next, is then just a quick note. And sometimes it's just a bullet point, right? But it's like, okay, here was the thing we needed to follow up on. Now here's what we did about it. And again, that also goes back to the backlog. Depending on, everybody's got different preferences for tools, and I'm fairly agnostic when it comes to tools, but I do like the tracking components of some. So if story UX 1, 2, 3 had these two outcomes, you can link in a lot of the tools. I'm specifically thinking of Jira, but a lot of the tools you can link future work to past work. And it can be as simple as just like copying and pasting and putting the story number or whatever in, so that you can at least go back and reference what you did. And so, if you ran a piece of research that compared two options, and the next kind of chunk of work is to implement one of the options, you can just put like a line in the story summary that says like, based off of this story. And it's not a perfect system. It requires, frankly, a lot of administration and making sure that you're doing it, which is why I tend to go for simplest possible tooling, aka often I am using things like Google Docs and hyperlinks to things, but it works. So yeah, I don't have a great overarching solution though.
If you did, we wouldn't be talking to you because you'd be rich and famous.
That's fair. I'd be on the moon right now.
Totally. So what about any tips or tricks to get people, your teammates, your colleagues, your stakeholders to show up for more than one session, especially in this Zoom age? And anything to also encourage developers to show up and watch. And maybe, I know specifically for me, I've had trouble with their managers. Like they really wanted to come, but the managers felt like they were better served actually coding. So I had to convince that manager. What has been your experience?
Yeah. Well, so again, I'll go ahead and say that this is probably something where if I had an exact right solution, I would also not be here because I'd be a billionaire. But I will go back to a couple of things. One is that relationship capital is huge. Building a personal relationship with someone where you can trust and respect them, means that it will make it that much easier for you to convince them of something. But more than that, I really try to focus on how is what I'm going to do with this research going to serve you, or how do I need your expertise in order to make this successful? So for instance, I have previously worked on a project that was super, super technical, and I knew that I needed the insight of one of the developers on my team, who was the one who built the system. He was the only one who knew the nuance of how it worked. And I straight up went to him and said, listen, you're the only one who knows how that shit works. You're the one who built it. I need your help. And to be honest, kind of nobody doesn't like to hear how much they're needed, right? Nobody is like, oh, I don't like hearing that, screw you, right? Like everyone's like, ooh, you need my expertise, great. And the same can be done for, managers or whoever. If you say, listen, I really need the insight of a person on your team for this hour or these 2 hours or whatever, because otherwise I'm not going to know how to interpret this information, and it's going to take us all like 5 times as long to figure out what to do with this thing. It's not untrue, but it's presenting it in a way that helps them see, like, we're all ultimately in this together. We all want to build great stuff, right? Like, we all want our products to be successful and our companies to do well. Like, that's all ultimately what we're here for. And so if you can kind of take a step back from the day-to-day of like, I have 82 trillion meetings and I'm on Zoom from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, and I will scream the next time that I have something put on my calendar without being asked. If you can kind of help people remember like the ultimate goal, like, I'm trying to help this team build the best possible stuff. And sometimes I need your help to make that happen. That I have found has been a really effective way for me to do some convincing. But, also sometimes you just get prickly people or schedules don't work. So also the other piece of advice that I have is don't take it personally. Sometimes it just is what it is, and you're going to have to make do with the people that you can get.
Totally. I know we have a repo, which we'll be talking about next month, at my company, and I try to upload the videos every day and then have it do auto transcribe. And I always do a plug of, you can watch them or you can just read through the transcript, same thing, make some time. So hopefully they will. And the best part about that repo is you can actually see who's seen the page. So I know if you looked at it or not. All right. So another question about metrics. So they were wondering about what some examples might be of some actionable metrics, especially when you're using discovery, like you're practicing a discovery methodology or hypothesis. Like, what would those metrics look like?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give like the most simple example first, because I feel like this is one that everyone can connect to. So if you sell anything, which a lot of places do, a very, very simple metric can be something like, if we improve the checkout process, then our core user base will spend more money. And we'll know that that is true when either, their average order number goes up, or the number of orders goes up, or the number of customers goes up, or the ticket price goes up of the items, whatever it is. I use e-commerce a lot as an example for that, because it is one that mostly everybody can wrap their head around, right? So whether you need, so let's just say you need this effort to earn you $100,000. So you can earn $100,000 by having 100,000 people spend $1. You can have it by 100 people spending $1,000. Like, whatever that looks like, that is a hard target. However, as you referenced and as we kind of discussed, that is much easier for like an evaluation of a new tool or an improved process or something. Sometimes you just have to make an informed guess. And it's really less about, especially for exploration, it's less about what the actionable metric is and more about having the conversation of what defines success to you. So an example, I was working with a big financial firm who does investment banking, and they wanted to offer basically a new product line of investments that for people who really wanted to be eco-friendly, right? And so we were doing a bunch of research for them, trying to help them understand what that might look like, what really motivated people, et cetera. And basically the conversation that we had around, we were trying to even figure out, like, are there enough people interested in this thing for them to invest building this, right? So like super exploratory. But the conversation that we had around what was an actionable metric was, can we even get to the point where we can come up with like 2 or 3 defining characteristics that we could even define one core persona? Are they even, like, is this target audience even similar enough that we could design something for one specific persona? Or are there too many different, kind of varying motivations and behavioral components to interrupt this, so, or to make this happen. So the way that we sort of defined success for that first round of research was, is there enough of a pattern for us to be able to delineate like 2 or 3 different clear sections or not, right? And so that's actionable in that it is a concrete thing. It is objective. We either come up with the pattern or we don't. But it didn't say what the pattern was. It didn't say, like, is this viable or not? The conversation was just, can we even define enough of those things? And so it's basically really what it's about, is defining what success looks like for that team. And then also like defining what that means, what you'll do with the information, right? Because if we had gone through that and couldn't clearly delineate a couple of different personas, we would have had to have a conversation like, okay, do we need to do some more exploratory interviews? Do we need to purposely recruit differently? Do we need to narrow our scope? Do we need to broaden our scope, right? Like we would have had to have another conversation. Turns out in that case, we did in fact find some clearly defining personas, so it was fine. But it's more about having the conversation, especially with the business side and the product managers and stuff, like what does success look like and what does that mean? Like what decisions will we make based on the information? Not just, okay, great, we made $10 more.
Right.
Super. Like, what do we do with that? Does that mean we're building it? How do we know? Does that mean we're investing the time for the entire new feature, or are we going to do part of it, right? Like, so having those conversations up front, and to be like really frank, that's usually a job that people say is not for researchers. That's usually a job that people say is for the business side of things, or the product managers or whatever. But by framing it that way, it forces those people to have that conversation with you, which also forces, but in a way that makes sense to them. Like, of course, oh yes, we'll have this conversation with you about this because it refers to the research. So it also is sort of a sneaky way to make sure that you have information and context and also potentially influence over some of those business decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And I know in my career, I've come to the realization that I may be called a researcher, but I have worn every hat, possibly not the dev hat, because you don't want me coding either, but I have worn every other hat there is at a company. And you really do need to do that. You have to have these varied conversations with people, and you have to meet them where they are in the conversation too. Because if you don't, it's going to be a very difficult conversation. You're not going to get what you need to get out of it, for sure.
Yes, 100%. That 100 emoji is flashing in my brain right now.
Yes, totally. And then we got the 10,000 one at work. So yes, no, totally. All right. I think we've got a couple more questions, but I know it's getting a little bit later and we still have our networking portion of the evening to go through. So I'm going to call it with those few questions. Amanda, is there any other parting words of wisdom you'd like to tell everybody before we break for networking?
No, I really just want to remind everyone that, again, all of these are tips that I have seen work well in various ways at different organizations, but ultimately, like, you're going to have to test these things out. You're going to have to sort of configure them for what works for your individual team. And this isn't just true for Agile, but really kind of working on that relationship capital and getting to know and trust your teammates and getting them to know and trust you. Is the number one tip that I have for every researcher. Like, even if your research skills suck, you'll do much better if you've got good relationships than if you have like excellent research skills and no relationship skills. So yeah. Also, I will say, I know that we're kind of moving on, but if people have specific questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever. I'll do my best to respond to all of the questions if I can.
Cool. Excellent. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. And you're more than welcome to hang
in 3-week sprints. So we're now working in 2-week sprints, and I've been trying to figure out the right way to create the cadence for that. And we've been having challenges in that, the 3-week was almost like perfect. We would plan, test, and then synthesize in the last week. And it was just like everything worked perfectly. But with 2 weeks, we were finding it a real big challenge to be able to get everything done in one sprint. And then there was like the request from management or from the stakeholders to do research every single sprint. And I found that we were losing a lot of insights. Like there was things that we would discover, we wouldn't have time, we might be able to synthesize, but not share. And so we would lose a lot of insights and not be able to implement it, or like it would get maybe a 30-minute conversation, no decision making, and then we would just move on. And I'm just curious what other people's experiences are or how you manage that.
It's like the dark side of Agile. Yeah. Yeah. 2 weeks is not enough. My advice is to, with the management, I don't know how to get around that. Like whatever they think you can do in 2 weeks, but you were doing in 3, I'm not really sure why now 2 weeks is magical and you should be able to do the same amount of work in a week less time. But I've worked in 2 week sprints. I've worked in 3 week. I've worked in 4 week, which is a little too long sprints. And what I would suggest, if you can sell this to your management, is to schedule your own cadence. So you're going to take 1 week from sprint 1, and then in sprint 2, you'll use those 2 weeks to perform the test and analyze, and then use another week from sprint 3 to prepare for the next round. So like you're borrowing each time from the sprint, and you're running your own 3 week cadence parallel to theirs. You're just offset by a week. And so you're still working, you're still doing things every sprint, but you're not going to do a full entire research project every 2 weeks. I didn't even do that when I was working at a consulting firm. We didn't, I mean, that's too tight of a turnaround time.
We do something similar, Lori. Like we work in 2 week sprints for our tech and design teams. And for research, they work, with us in our same sprints. But instead of having an entire research project in one sprint, we basically say, well, this research project is an epic, and we break that epic down into stories for research and say, based on capacity, maybe in this sprint, all you can get done is kick off recruiting, and finalize the discussion guide, maybe get the discussion guide reviewed by legal, and that's your sprint deliverable, a legal reviewed discussion guide and kicked off recruitment. And then in the following sprint, you would have planned in your backlog, the facilitation, organizing notes, first draft of synthesis, and a, draft of your share out deck, and then maybe the next sprint is like, refining your share out deck, whatever it might be. And so just as you plan your research, plan all the stories that go in it, all the pieces that need to happen, and then distribute them in whatever sprints you need to get them done. And that's kind of how we framed it. But every company works a little bit differently.
I have a question for your 2 week sprint where you're doing 2 weeks for preparing and 2 weeks for running and analyzing. How many, obviously I'm assuming this is mostly qualitative, but how many participants are you researching with? Is this like 4 to 5 or is it more?
I'd say the average is about 6 to 8. So multiply and scale accordingly when you have more people to talk to or more segments to research with, as well as if it's discovery work. There's a lot more data to deal with than just doing a usability test. So I would give yourself enough time to do the data analysis, especially if you've not done that before. Give yourself a break, give yourself some more time. Overestimate, especially if it's your first time. If you're getting stakeholders involved in analyzing the data, give yourself some more time, especially if they've never done it before. They're an interesting group. They want to help, but they can't do it as fast as you can, as precise as you can. And you're going to spend a lot of your time that you would have been doing the analysis, helping them to learn how to do the analysis. Do it a couple of times, they'll get as fast as you are. But the first couple of times, give yourself some more time. Yeah. What other questions y'all have about anything?
So I have a question. Amanda talked a lot about exploratory research and how you do most exploratory research within the Agile environment. How do you do validation research, if at all? Like, is there a way to do this in the Agile?
Foundational research.
No, validation research.
Oh, validation,
So-
yeah. Validation, like usability testing, sometimes that's the easiest one to work into the sprint cadence, because you typically can insert yourself in the design process. Designers are working on the prototype. You can sit with them, sit now with them and figure out like what scenarios are they designing for. You can craft your discussion guide, your testing guide around those scenarios. Once they're done with the prototype in whatever platform, they can hand it off to you pretty seamlessly. You can then conduct those sessions. So that kind of stuff really works well in an Agile framework, especially when you're usually testing with 6 to 8 people. It's usually not going to go longer than an hour, typically, depending on what you're testing in the usability session. It's easier, and the data is a lot more streamlined than it would be in foundational or discovery research.
I see. I guess I've mostly faced the problem where the design is just changing so often and so constantly that it's just hard to, like, the designers don't really have like they have 5 different concepts. They aren't sure which direction we're gonna take, but yeah.
Get them to narrow it down to 3 and do a best of breed test. You could do that. Like, you could, depending on how involved your prototypes are in your scenarios, you could still do 3 in probably like an hour and 15 with a participant, and, you know, switch it up, do ABC, do CAB, whatever order, and you could get a best of breed test. But they got to narrow it down. 5 is too many. 5 tells me they don't know enough about the problem that they're designing to solve too. So that would be my advice. And then to talk with them too about, like, hey guys, hey gals, I need this, like, choose something. I need it by Tuesday. It's got to be, you've got to stop and then come to my sessions and then build some time in to modify the designs after the testing and the analysis is done, because we're going to learn some things that we don't know now.
Gotcha.
And sometimes they're
Yeah.
afraid to. Sometimes they just want to tinker it with it until Dev says they're ready to do engineering on it, and you got to stop. Doris, what's your question? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, one thing I was going to add is I learned this from Lori when we worked together, actually, is like assigning a cutoff date for when the designs are done before testing. And if they're still tweaking, then we need to move the test or we need to do something, and being super clear on, like, hey, the final designs that we're going to go into testing are due 3 days before the actual test, so I can tweak my guide. And if they're after that, like, we're going to move on. The first time you cancel a study, they learn and to get to it early. So I learned that one from Lori. Thank you, Lori.
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah. Doris, what's your question?
So I was wondering, we at my company, we do not really work agile. I mean, they do say we do, but we really don't. Now, I work across everything that we do pretty much. And so I've got 2 questions. One is, when you guys do agile, do you work on several projects at the same time, or just the one is my question. And the other question is, the cadence that was mentioned, that one could schedule regularly. I wouldn't know how to do that for my work, because I don't know. One day I need to recruit people who are involved in financial reporting. Then another time it is people who do communications. Yeah, so what are your thoughts and your experiences on that?
Get them to hire more people, Doris. You're doing too much.
We're trying. So one position is advertised, and we had more before, but even then you wouldn't know what you're going to be working on that level. I mean, I knew I would not be working on apps, but the apps person also didn't know, in my app stuff, do I work on communications for apps or financial stuff for apps? So yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. So what I have to do right now where I work is I meet with all of my product managers on like a 6-week cadence. And I don't actually work in an Agile framework right now. I have in the past, and I'm a certified Scrum Master, all that jazz. But what I need to find out from them is what they're planning. Because if I don't know what they're planning, I cannot plan.
No.
And so that's the kind of conversations I have with them. What are the questions that you're going to need to get answered in the next quarter, maybe month, 2 months? That would be good. If you cannot tell me, I cannot support you. I have plenty of people to support. I will go and support the people who can plan, because that helps me to support them. So that's the first step.
Do you say that to them?
Yeah, I do.
That's a good idea, because that's what I practically do as well. Because, you know, if person A tells me this and this and this is what I will need, then if the other person says, tomorrow I need you to do this.
Nope.
It's like, I'm sorry.
How? That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's exactly right. And they'll learn. And as you communicate with them about like how you have to, why you need it, and how it will help them if they can give it to you earlier, they will learn. And once they find and they look at their colleagues who are getting your help, and they're like, well, I wanted that.
Mhm.
Encourage that colleague, encourage that product manager to tell them how you and them work together to make that happen. And they will learn, and they will do it, or they will leave. You know, they may not even stay, depending on how it goes at the company.
Yeah.
But that's the first step. You've got to get a control in your head around what are all of the needs. And then you work with them to understand the timelines. And then you need somebody to referee. Because if your situation is anything like my situation, you've got 5 PMs all wanting stuff in the same month, you are but one person. You cannot do it. You cannot do all those things.
Yeah.
You need somebody who is higher than they are, preferably in charge of them, to make the calls on the prioritization for the projects. They have to tell you, Doris, you need to work on A, B, and C. Those are the highest priorities right now. And you go back and you tell them, the director told me this. This is what I'm planning. This is how I've planned it out. This is what we're going to do. And this is how we're going to do it. When those projects are done, we'll reassess and see how we can pull in the next ones for the next time, if they're still a priority. And it's like what I was telling Amanda, it's like all these different hats researchers have to wear. It's not just design and research.
No.
It's people and product management and product ownership and all of these different hats that you're constantly putting on throughout the day, just so you can do your job of researching. It's kind of crazy.
This is much bigger than which method do I use or who do I recruit. For me, it's like, how do I have insight in the roadmap? How do I influence how do I plan? How do I communicate upwards and make things happen? That's the big thing right now.
Yes.
Ooh.
And it's very hard, but if you can find the right people to be your champions and you can be their champions, you will find a nice place to live, and you'll drum up more business too, and in the right way, not just the panic. Oh my God, I need something next week. I have told people, Doris, I have told product managers, I've actually laughed at them. Now I've known them for more than just a few months when I did this, but I had a product manager come to me and she's like, yeah, I think I want you to run a research next week. I'm like, no. And that's not how this works. I need at least 3 weeks notice. It's like dating. I don't drop everything just to go out tomorrow night with you. You have to plan. We need to know, like, who are we looking for? Why are we even doing this? Because just because they think they have a need, it may not even be something that you need to research. It may be a design pattern instead that they need to implement, and they don't need you at all. So, yeah.
Ooh, okay.
When you said 3 weeks for a research project, you're talking about a qualitative study. You're not talking about going to look up some metrics or something.
No, I deal mainly with qualitative stuff. Yeah.
All right. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. And quantitative, it depends on what's going on, because sometimes you might need to put that webhook or whatever it is into the site and let it run for a while, or let it run for a day or two, and then go back and look at the data and say, okay, we're getting some good stuff. Let's let it run for 3 weeks.
Right.
We'll
right. But there are some things that you can do in less than 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and if you have the data, you should be able just to pull it right there and be able to fiddle with it for a few days and make some conclusions. But sometimes, often I've run into places where they're like, oh, I guess we could have put a metric there. Why don't you? And then we can talk. So there's always that lead time.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So Lori, a lot of what you're talking about is really kind of managing research ops, right? So you've got an intake form and you've got this whole process where they have to come to you and sort of justify the need and the question, the prioritization for the research, because I agree, we can get overwhelmed with a million ad hoc research requests coming in all over the place. And each one of them may only take, like maybe all stuff we can do is just desk research, right? But then we'll never get to the strategic stuff. And we're always fighting, like Doris was talking, to get further upstream, right, into the strategic realm, so that we're having to do less of this reactive stuff. And I think it's interesting, even as we talk about incorporating into Agile, we're also talking about having a parallel sprint process to the dev sprint process. So there always has to be an order to things. It's not always just we work with the developers in this 2-week sprint. We do research, design, development, and validation. There's always a bit of a waterfall creeping in, even to our Agile processes.
Yeah, and I honestly believe it's because Agile is not meant for everything. There's no one size of Agile will fit everything. If 2-week development sprints fits your development team, yay. If research needs 3 weeks and design needs 4, why not let them have it? If what they're going to produce is the thing that is needed to be produced and it's produced with high quality, what does it matter how long the sprints are, as long as you're all coordinated with what you're working on? But some organizations really fall into that trap of thou shalt only have 2-week sprints in this whole entire 20,000 person organization. This is how we're going to do Agile. And I think that's when people start to go rogue.
When I worked at a startup, we were trying to decide whether or not UX should be part of the Agile structure. And they hired an Agile expert to come in and evaluate us. And he said, no, UX should be separate from Agile. It shouldn't be, it should be working in concert with Agile, but it should not be embedded in the Agile process. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think the most important thing is that you give whatever the processes are that need to process time to process. So if that organization wanted to do 2-week sprints, yeah, I would probably say that too as an Agile consultant. Like no researcher in their right mind would be turning and burning every 2 weeks on anything, even survey data. You shouldn't be turning and burning that fast on. But if you allowed them to have a 3-week sprint or a 4-week sprint, then sure, they can be part of it. I typically have done within the UX team, we had our own sprint cadence that we kind of did parallel, like I was talking about earlier, with other parts of the organization. So we had stories, we groomed, we had a backlog, we did all of those Agile processes that dev teams do, but we had our own cadence to do it with. And I actually really liked that because I found that going through the sizing process and the stories really solidified what we were actually working on. Without that, it can really become amorphous and really pink and fuzzy really fast. And if you're not really skilled in asking those questions to your stakeholders all the time about what are we doing, why are we doing it, what's the goal, what's the hypothesis, it can get out of control real fast. But with Agile, and some of the practices with your teammates asking you, well, Lori, you said that you're going to be studying this one thing. I have questions about that. And doing that in that planning process really helps break down some of the blind spots that you may have had and didn't know about until you got into research and you're like, oh shit, I should have asked a question about this and I didn't. And now I don't know what to do. We're 3 people into 8. participants. So I really liked that, and the sizing, and then being able to understand the velocity over time, because as limited resources, we tend to take on more than we can achieve, and having that velocity to fall back on to say to my stakeholders, dude, I'm at 21 points. I can't take on anymore. I know my velocity, I cannot. And talking to them with that vocabulary is very similar to how engineering talks. So they were familiar with that, and they didn't argue because they understood what I was saying to them. And it sounds better to their ears at that point in that organization than me saying, well, research just takes 3 weeks, just takes 3 weeks. Leave me alone, let me have 3 weeks. And then telling them from a point perspective made more sense to them. So it's all about meeting them where they are.
Lori, this is Jimmy Chandler. I just want Elizabeth and Lori to jump in. I would have been concerned if a so-called consultant told me that UX cannot work with Agile, and I would question why did they say that, and how do they know that, and what is their experience with UX?
It wasn't that they couldn't work with Agile. He just didn't feel that UX should be embedded in the Agile process.
Right. So yeah, I misspoke. I understood what you meant. I apologize.
Okay.
I would still have pushed back, and so I don't. It doesn't. I'm not trying to criticize. I'm trying to say for the whole Zoom meeting here, if anybody if someone said that to me, I would have asked them why that's true, and I would pull out there are plenty of successful Agile teams in the world that have UX embedded. And in fact, some of the leaders in our field are saying that we need to be embedded more. And this is why, and there's lots of resources. There are at least some resources out there that'll help you, not fight, but make that argument.
Justify.
I wasn't the decision maker at the time, so
Yeah,
I was
hey,
that this was what was told to the decision maker.
I get it. No, I wanted to bring that up because I think,
Okay.
and I've seen it work both where it's in parallel. I've seen it work where the UX team has their own design sprints or research sprints, and I've seen it embedded. Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, no, Jimmy, it was a great question. I mean, I've seen it work all kinds of ways too. And I think when you start to put constraints on a process that perhaps is not very well understood outside of the very small team that it's being practiced in, it can be very hard for the practitioners to continue the practice, right? So if you're coming in and telling a researcher, you've got 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, I want a new research project, and they're not really understanding, people don't grow on trees. I can't go to Starbucks right now to go find anybody to research with to turn and burn on this stuff. And my product managers don't even have enough stuff for me to test every 2 weeks. It doesn't make sense in that perspective to say you must do these things every 2 weeks. Could you take in tasks and self-assign and break things down into user stories and accomplish them in 2 weeks? Yes, you can. But it's when you put that other layer of, our expectation is you will conduct and analyze a full research study in 2 weeks. I think that's when it kind of breaks. Everything breaks. If you're just allowing me to work in 2 week chunks and I can take 4 weeks or 3 weeks to do a project, I'm good, because you're allowing me to be the master of my tasks, right? Which is really what Agile is supposed to be. The team is supposed to drive the work that they take on with the guidance of the product owner or the product manager. It's making sure that they're building the thing that needs to be built. But the team decides what help they need, and the team decides the cadence, and the team decides what goes into their sprints. So I think that's kind of where I've seen it kind of break down when UX is involved.
I have a question. Has anybody had any experience applying Agile research or research sprints within an agency context?
I was embedded when we were doing ours. But I would suppose, I guess like agency, you've got a certain time frame to do a project, right? They usually contract with you for 6 weeks or whatever it might be. And I guess you could consider the contract term your Agile sprint, or you could break it into smaller sprints, depending on what's going on. I don't know. My gut says like you need to figure out who else you're coordinating with on that project at the agency. So if you're just doing research, because I've been at agencies where I just was the researcher, that's all they contracted with us to do. And I've been at agencies where they would go through the marketing department and they would create an app and then we would test it. So there was some coordination there with each one of those stages for the when you come to the research piece.
And I mean, the difficulty we have is that we, a researcher is typically working on 3 projects at the same time, which have different time frames and totally different, so you're kind of, so we're trying to kind of work out how to reduce time, but just focus on one thing at a time. That's the main.
Oh man, if I could only
in a
focus on one thing at a
utopian
time.
world.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, I don't know a researcher that's not constantly prepping for another project while they're in the midst of a project in some way, shape, or form. So that's going to be a hard order, but good luck.
No, I know someone doing it. It's just, we're just trying to work out different ways of working that will avoid burnout.
More people. That's the hard answer, is more people, because there's never enough researchers to go around. The research to design ratio is off. The research to design to dev ratio is off. I
would love to know from the group if anybody, like just in general, has anything that has prevented burnout for y'all. I'll maybe kick us off with something. For me, when I was doing a lot of research, the thing that kept me going was when I shared insights with people that maybe weren't involved in the research and something clicked. And so trying to figure out ways to reuse my research reports or share them with new groups or do presentations and do more socialization of findings versus always in the grind of scheduling, running, synthesizing, et cetera, and doing more of those like socializing aspects and building that into my sprint plan. So that's definitely something that helped me. That's where I got energy, but would love to know from the rest of you, where do you get energy and how do you prevent burnout?
Well, I love it when I hear my product manager finally acquiesce to what I have been trying to tell him for the last 2 weeks. And he's like, yeah, you're right. We shouldn't do that. I'm like, yes, exactly. Can I get that in writing? And I also enjoy working with my designers who are always up for any kind of stuff I throw at them. Like today, I had a designer was showing me a design that I need to put in front of some of my participants. And I couldn't help myself. It had been a long day. And I just was like, no. I was like, oh no, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It's like one of the tenets of being a researcher. You never be that emphatic without a reason for anything. So he was very kind. He's like, no, tell me more. So I enjoy working with people who are open-minded and want to genuinely partner with me, and they'll have me partner with them in figuring out how to solve these problems. And then I always like to take jobs where there are other people who do the thing that I do, because otherwise you're going to get burnout real fast if there's not a big enough team.
Anyone else have good tips or tricks or things that give them energy? I know y'all have some good stuff.
For me, it's been also about communicating that you have a lot of stuff going on, and if you take a while to give your main takeaways or respond to an email or something, just communicate that you're in the middle of doing the data analysis for a study and planning for the next study, and just communicating that workload, I think is one piece of it. And another part that I haven't that I've heard, I haven't fully experienced myself, but I've heard recommendations as to other methods of getting the information. You don't always have to do a study to get the information that you need. You can always do desktop research or look at the app analytics. I mean, I know that could also take a long time, but just trying out different methods and even information that you can find out there from previous research, even if it's not particularly on that product, but similar products, I think could also help.
Oh, you're on mute, Lauren.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I love that, Monica. The first thing is like setting boundaries and communicating. Like, you don't have to get back to the email the same day, even setting an out of office, like, hey, I'm synthesizing research, heads down, like, I'll get back to you, in the next 2 days or so, or whatever it is. Like, such great tips. That's great.
All right, last call for any questions. All right. Well, thanks for hanging till the end, everybody. We appreciate it. Thanks for coming out and hearing Amanda talk earlier. Please take our survey that we will send you another link for. We are researchers. We want feedback. That's how we grow, and that's how we give you what you guys want. This is how we actually pick the topics and find our speakers, is directly from our community members. So let us know, and we'll be sending out the email pretty soon with the recording of this and anything else that we've got to tell you, and a link to our upcoming event about repos next month. All right, we'll see you later. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.